Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 7 about the judicial branch. It's Lesson 10 about arguing cases. In this lesson, you'll learn about briefs, amicus curiae briefs, oral arguments, and about the Solicitor General. In the previous lesson, we started talking about the processes that the Supreme Court follows. We began that in the last lesson by talking about how the Supreme Court accepts cases. And then the next two things that we'll be talking about in this and the following lesson is about arguing cases and deciding cases. So in this lesson, let's focus on the arguing of cases. And we're going to talk about three features of this. The first are what are called briefs. Here's an example of a brief. It's a written document submitted by a party to the case to the United States Supreme Court justices for them to read. A brief, though, is misleadingly called a brief. It is anything but brief. A brief is typically 50 pages long, and it's a carefully written explanation, written by lawyers, of why one party or the other should win the case. Next thing we want to talk about is amicus curiae briefs. Now, these are slightly different than the briefs just discussed above. That phrase amicus curiae is a Latin phrase, which literally means friend of the court. Amicus curiae briefs are submitted by parties that aren't involved in the case. Now, there's still written arguments about why one person or the other in the case should win, but because they're not submitted by either of those actual parties to the case, the justices consider these to be optional reading. So when the justices, after they've accepted a case for argument, issue their writ of certiorari, and put it on their schedule on the docket, then the parties of the case submit their briefs, and the Supreme Court justices say, yeah, we'll read those. They promise they'll read them. And then other interested parties submit briefs also. Those are called amicus curiae briefs. And it's up to the justices to decide whether they're going to read those or not. An example of amicus curiae briefs can be seen in the Hobby Lobby case. The Hobby Lobby case concerned enforcement of the Affordable Care Act, what's commonly known as Obamacare. The Obamacare required private businesses to provide certain kinds of coverage for women. It's sometimes characterized as birth control coverage. Other people characterize it as the things being covered being abortion procedures, essentially chemical abortions. And there are business owners out there, usually devout Christians, who don't think that they should be paying for insurance that will allow the women to get an abortion. And one of those companies that feels this way is Hobby Lobby. It's owned by a very small group of people, I think mostly family members, if not entirely, who share these beliefs in common. And they don't think their company should be used for this. So they sued to get an exception to Obamacare based on religious liberty, to not have to provide this coverage for their employees. Case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, certainly there were a lot of people out there that were not parties to this case who were interested in what the outcome would be. So many different groups were interested that 84 different amicus briefs were filed with the Supreme Court. In other words, 84 other groups looked at this, either religious groups or groups in favor of certain kinds of health care for women who were worried about what the outcome of the case would be, and so they submitted these briefs also arguing with the Supreme Court that either Hobby Lobby should win or that Hobby Lobby should lose. Remember, the Supreme Court can read these amicus curiae briefs at their option. They don't have to, but they promise they will read the actual briefs from the parties to the case. So they read Hobby Lobby's brief, but it was up to each justice whether they'd read any of the other ones. Now, just as an aside, in case you're wondering, Hobby Lobby won that case. Okay, the third element of arguing cases is oral arguments. Now notice that before oral arguments, through the briefs and the amicus curiae briefs, that the justices have been educated in the arguments that are out there in written form. They've had the parties carefully explain what their arguments are already. Then the justices could carefully read these and understand what they are. They then invite the two parties to the case to come to the Supreme Court building and stand before them to make their arguments. When they do this, each side is typically given 30 minutes to argue their case. Well, what happens during that 30 minutes while the justices are while the lawyers are standing there in front of the justices? Well, I once heard a story told by a man named Rex Lee. He was a man who had argued almost 60 cases before the United States Supreme Court. And he said when he went in to make arguments, he would bring a 3x5 card with him with 3 points on it that he wanted to make to the court. And he said he was lucky if he got to the second one in his 30 minutes. Well, wait a minute, how could he not get to the second point in 30 minutes? It's because he spent all his time answering questions from the justices. Now remember, they've already read the lawyer's argument in written form in the brief. And so when they bring the lawyer in for this 30 minutes to talk to him, they are ready to ask the lawyer questions. And the lawyer better be ready to answer them. One person who's particularly important in this process of oral arguments is a government official called the Solicitor General. The Solicitor General is the nation's top lawyer, a person chosen by the President to essentially be the lawyer for the United States of America. As the Solicitor General, then, this person has the role of arguing cases before the Supreme Court on behalf of the United States government. So if someone sues the United States government and says, oh, they're taking away my freedom of speech or whatever, and the case goes to the Supreme Court, of course the person complaining about their free speech being taken away will have their own lawyer there, and the United States government will have their lawyer also, which would be the Solicitor General of the United States. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. In the Supreme Court, what is a brief? Is it a garment people wear under their robes? Is it a short summary? Is it a spoken argument? Or is it a written argument? A brief is a written argument, and by no means is it brief. The limit is 50 pages, and the lawyers write all 50 pages usually. Who submits an amicus curiae brief? Is it a party to a case? Is it the respondent in the case? Is it the appellant in the case? Or is it a friend of the court? Amicus curiae literally means friend of the court. And what it's talking about is somebody who thinks they have something that the court should hear, but they're not an actual party to the case. Now, the other possible answers to the question here, party of the case, respondent, appellant, those are all different ways of describing the two people that are involved in the case. Amicus curiae is from someone outside of that, not a party to the case. What usually happens during oral arguments? Do the lawyers just end up running out of things to say? Do the justices ask lots of questions? Do the parties shout at each other, or does the audience rise up and protest? During oral arguments, the time is dominated by justices asking the lawyers questions. What is the job of the Solicitor General? Does the Solicitor General assist defendants in their cases? Or does the Solicitor General recruit lawyers to come work before the Supreme Court? Or is the Solicitor General the chief lawyer for the country? Or does the Solicitor General gather donations for the country? The Solicitor General is the chief lawyer for the country, meaning that they argue cases on behalf of the United States government before the Supreme Court. That concludes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 7. It'll be Lesson 11 about deciding these cases after they've been accepted and after they've been argued.